Hi, this is CJ with Cycletron. Today I'll be talking to you about our 1982 Yamaha Virago. It's the XV 750 model. Back in the day I had a 535 Virago. That was my first bike that I started out with. And then I traded that in for a 920 Virago, so I was really familiar with these bikes. Last November I spotted this bike on Cycle Trader. It was being sold by a motorcycle dealer up in Iowa. So we picked this bike up for $1,300. I got it really as a project bike over winter break for my boys and I to work on. It was a lot of fun. Bought it for $1,300, as I said. I probably put another $600 or $700 into it. Also, my son, who was wanting to learn how to ride a street bike, he'd had experience with dirt bikes before, but this was his first street bike. So it took us about a month to get the work that we needed to get done on the bike, and then we got it street worthy, and away we went. So today I'd like to talk about that whole experience of getting a bike that's nearly 40 years old and what you can expect with a bike from that age. I mean, obviously it doesn't have modern performance in terms of engine and braking and suspension and things that we've grown accustomed to if you've been on a bike that was made in the last 10 years. So it's got a drum rear brakes. The suspension isn't all that tight, but it's a really a fun bike. There's something raw about the experience of riding this bike. And of course, if you know you don't have ABS and traction control and some of those other modern electronic rider intervention aids, you should be a lot more careful on an older bike like this. Certainly, I've been riding newer bikes for many years, and then when I get an older bike like this, I have to make a mental note. Oh, I need to plan on my braking a little bit more. I need to think about braking sooner and not just rely on being able to stop on a dime like I might with a newer bike. But I'll talk about what we did to get this bike roadworthy. Also, I want to talk about the process of buying an old bike, because it can be very rewarding, and you can get it up and running without too much money or effort, or it can turn into a complete money pit where you're unable to get parts and you're in over your head. So we did mostly this work ourselves. I did get some help from a motorcycle dealership that we've had a long-standing relationship with. What I find is it's good to have a good relationship with one or more local motorcycle dealerships. A lot of times they'll take on an older bike in the winter when they're slower, but generally most dealerships won't take a bike in for service or repair that's older than 20 years in age, and in some cases they won't take a bike that's 10 years older in age. And the reason for that is things can break on an old bike. There's corrosion, it's harder to get parts, and the last thing a dealership wants to have is to take your bike in with the idea of working on a particular part, and in the process of disassembling it and getting ready, find out something else breaks, and then they're not able to get a part, and the bike is just simply stuck in their shop. I had this experience when we took off the front wheel. I had to remove the hub for the speedometer, where the cable mounts to the hub for the speedometer, and that little nut that little screw had corroded, that bolt, and broke off. And there were none of those hubs available. I think I found one. It was used, and somebody wanted $200 for it. So instead, I drilled the hole out. I made my own stud out of a 1/4-20 bolt and epoxied it in, and was able to reattach the cable to the hub. It was basically after the cable plugs in, there's a little bolt that goes into the hub to secure it. So, you know, it depends too, if you want to get an older bike, how handy you are. Are you able to do a little bit of your own fabrication? Do you have a relationship with that shop? If you don't have a dealer that'll work on an older bike, seek out an independent motorcycle shop that would typically work on these bikes. So let me talk to you about what we did for this bike. First, let's start this up. You might hear a little bit of starter clutch chatter. It's way better than it was when we first bought the bike. It used to rattle for like 3 minutes. These are Mac about that exhaust. Again, it's a Mac Performance exhaust. I'll put the part number in the link below. Again, part of that relationship with the dealer, I would go to them, have them help me hunt for parts. They found this Mac Performance exhaust that fits this Farrago. They told me it was the last one they had in stock. I don't know if any more are out there. There may be other manufacturers where you can get a bike exhaust for a bike like this, but that's just sort of the things you run into. So just kind of go through what we did. I replaced the shoes inside the drum. We replaced both tires. I mean, that's pretty common. We got this bike, it had 12,000 miles on the odometer, and a bike that's nearly 40 years old, that means that bike's been setting for long periods of time. So when you pick up an older bike, you might find that you have really old tires, and I'd recommend, if you've got tires say over 5 years old, even if they look like they're in good condition, to get rid of them and replace them with new tires, because the rubber's going to be too hard, prone to cracking and breaking. The tires that came off of this bike were originally were made in 1999. So if you can believe that, I wouldn't even ride a bike home from the dealership with tires that old. We picked this bike up on a trailer towed by my truck. But so we replaced the exhaust, the drum shoes in the rear. We rebuilt the master cylinder for the front brake. The forks were fine, didn't need to be redone. Replaced the calipers for the front brake, and rebuilt the caliper as well. My son added a windscreen, GV windscreen. We had a little bit of rust in the tank, so I cleaned it up with vinegar and some bolts. Kind of left it for 3 or 4 days and agitated it periodically and got us all the old rust out, and then neutralized the vinegar that was in there, and then we applied Red-Kote. It's a epoxy type material that provides a coating over the tank. So a lot of these older bikes have steel tanks that are prone to rust, and particularly with ethanol blend fuels, ethanol it attracts water, and it'll usually cause water to float at the top of your fuel. And if the bike sits for any length of time, that water really will corrode a steel line tank or a steel tank. So if you have an older bike, that's something you want to look at, is not only your tank but also your fuel lines and everything else that were not made with ethanol fuel blends in mind. Let's see, what else did we do this bike? Oh, replace it was missing a spring with the starter clutch. You hear a little bit of rattling when you start this bike. That's pretty minor. It was way worse when we got the bike because it was missing a spring. So I had to take the left side cover off, and it took forever. I mean, hours and hours of trial and error. And then I realized after I took the left foot peg off, I was able to finally get that cover in proper alignment and holding all the springs and everything for the starter clutch assembly together, because the magnet in the stator was causing things to become misaligned. But once I took that left foot peg off, I was good. So again, working with older bikes, I would recommend giving any nuts or bolts that you take off a good soak with a penetrating oil to reduce the chance that you're going to break them off. Certainly you don't want to break off things that go in the engine case. And after we got the bike running, it still idled a little rough, so we took it to the dealer, and they cleaned and synced the carbs for me. I just didn't have all the parts or the tools to do the carb cleaning myself. And that's something else I learned. At this particular shop's a big shop. They got a lot of different they got a lot of mechanics there, and they gave this bike to the older bike mechanic who had experience working on carbureted motorcycles. So depending on the dealership you go to, you might find that they have skilled mechanics, but they're basically accustomed to taking a modern bike, plugging the ECU into a computer, running a diagnostic code, and doing things like that, and not so much the old school mechanical stuff, and particularly when you run the risk of something breaking and then having poor availability of parts. So I'd say before you pick up an old bike, I'd recommend buying a bike that is from one of the bigger manufacturers, you know, Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, and pick a model that was made for many years with not a lot of changes between model years, and you'll most likely have the most success with finding not only OEM parts, but other aftermarket parts for the motorcycle. That was something. This bike set the ragged edge of how difficult it may be to get parts for it. So we had to replace the starter solenoid. That went out, but right now the bike is solid, and we ride it pretty regularly. So it's just a lot of fun. It's as much fun to ride this bike as any of our newer bikes. It's hard to explain. There's something different about it, more elemental, more raw, but it's not something I'd necessarily recommend as a daily rider. It's sort of maybe a once a week kind of bike if you've got a more modern bike, just for the safety and overall performance. My boy's now riding that Vulcan, and I've got another video about the Yamaha YZF 600R that we bought on salvage and got back into running condition. So we've been riding those two bikes quite a bit, but this bike's still a lot of fun. So with that, please drop me any comments, and we'll see you soon.